For over half a century, there have been rumors of secretive facilities and bases hidden deep below the surface of the sprawling North American landscape. Bringing his patrol car to a halt, Gabriel Valdez stared out through the driver's side window at the dark mass lying not far from the side of the road, and then cursed under his breath. For the briefest of moments, he tried to convince himself that the most sensible course of action would be to simply drive on, away from this place, and to ignore what he had seen. And yet his curiosity urged him to exit the vehicle, to conduct a closer inspection, and confirm what his instincts and fears were telling him. With a heavy sigh, Patrolman used his radio to inform the dispatcher of his location, before opening the driver's side door and making his way across the scrub. Deep down, he had known what he would find before he even reached the carcass. A cursory inspection confirmed that this cadaver had been left just like the others he had attended upon. A series of diamond-shaped indentations had been carved into various points of the hide, with several layers of skin having apparently been removed in an expert fashion. The creature's eyes, nose, and tongue were all missing, despite there being no sign of any wider animal predation having taken place. It was almost certain that the reproductive glands would be absent, as well as a number of other key internal organs, all removed in what presented as a clean and sterile manner. As he stood regarding the lack of any tracks or disturbed foliage on the ground surrounding the animal's corpse, Valdez now became aware of the low rumble of an approaching vehicle. Looking up from the grisly scene, he caught sight of a 5-ton truck painted in army camouflage, heading along the highway towards him. The transport began to slow as it approached the point where he'd left his patrol car, its occupants returning the questioning gaze he had offered as they passed, before it pulled away at greater speed. As he watched the dust cloud thrown up by its passing dissipate, Valdez found himself experiencing a whole host of emotions. Confusion, a small degree of fear, but most of all, he felt anger, directed towards those he blamed for the death of this creature, for the deaths of all the slain animals he had found in recent months, and the wider falsehood that their slaughter had been used to perpetuate. A lie fabricated for one purpose and one purpose only: to keep local residents away from the neighboring mesa, for fear that something resided there which neither he nor any other earthly power could hope to protect them from. The town of Dulce in New Mexico would not come into existence until the end of the 19th century, when US authorities ordered the local Apache tribe to settle itself permanently in one place. The area's Native American population duly complied with this instruction, forming the Jicarilla Apache Reservation, around which the town would eventually be established. For the next century and a half, the inhabitants of this small backwater community would live their lives in relative peace, a short distance from the slopes of the adjoining Archuleta Mesa. There had always been tales of high strangeness associated with the region, from weird light anomalies witnessed in the night sky to Bigfoot-like creatures seen wandering the scrub. But by the late 1970s, the looming shadow cast by this towering mountain peak would begin to take on a sinister connotation, with the discovery of a series of bizarre cattle mutilations. Following several complaints by ranchers and farmers to the local police department, insisting that someone or something was slaughtering their livestock, an officer by the name of Gabriel Valdez was ordered to investigate the matter. But after visiting the affected properties, the investigator often returned to his superiors with far more questions than answers. Usually, only one animal in the herds which were targeted had been affected, and it had been dispatched in a manner which seemed to discount the involvement of any natural predator. Although key sensory and internal organs had been removed from the carcasses, there were never any indications that the flesh had been consumed by a potential attacker. In fact, these bodies would remain untouched by scavengers for weeks after the event, a phenomenon previously unheard of within this harsh and unrelenting environment. The report submitted by Officer Valdez also highlighted the lack of disturbance in the soft and sandy ground surrounding the remains, offering no hint as to who or what was responsible. Due to the discovery of shattered bones in some cases, his suggestion that the bodies had been dropped from a great height was something he would go on to be questioned over at some length. It soon became apparent to his superiors that Officer Valdez had no fixed agenda and was not promoting any theory in particular regarding the deaths of these animals. Instead, his report simply documented everything he had encountered during his investigation and demonstrated that he had discounted all of the most obvious explanations for the deaths. But situations would soon unfold, setting in motion a chain of events which would quash any hopes the investigator might have had in maintaining a calm and rational assessment of the incidents plaguing his community. During the summer of 1986, a resident named Jerry Julian approached the local police department to report that someone had attempted to abduct her from her home while she was sleeping. Julian explained to the attending officers that the evening prior, she and her husband had driven out in their flatbed truck to the slopes of the Archuleta Mesa to do a bit of stargazing. After a short time, Julian's attention had been drawn to one star in particular, which seemed to be moving through the night sky. As she and her husband looked on in wonder, the celestial body in question suddenly began to descend from the heavens, landing on the ground a short distance away. Gradually, the bright light before them began to diminish, revealing a metallic structure from which a small set of steps descended. Two small figures then slowly made their way down the metallic walkway before they set off on foot in the direction of the married couple. With a frightened cry, Julian's husband had grabbed her by the shoulders, bundled her into his pickup, and frantically attempted to start the engine. She continued to stare back in terror at the two squat figures slowly advancing upon the vehicle as the engine repeatedly failed to turn over. It was only when the strangers were mere meters away from the rear of the truck, reaching out as if to take hold of it, that the motor suddenly fired into life and allowed the couple to escape. Later that night, having decided not to report the matter, the couple had gone to bed, only for Julian to awaken in the early hours of the morning due to a strange tugging sensation. Looking down towards the bottom of her bed, she could see two shadowy figures, identical to those she had witnessed emerging from the strange craft earlier that night. Suddenly realizing she could feel her sheets being pulled off the bed to expose her lower body, Julian attempted to scream, but nothing more than a hoarse and raspy sound had emerged from her mouth. This quiet whimper, however, had been sufficient to awaken her sleeping husband, at which point the two figures had immediately vanished. When questioned further by federal agents who had been tasked with attending the incident, Julian claimed the existence of these entities was common knowledge amongst the native community. She even went as far to describe a large hole bored deep into the mountain face, hidden away much further up the slopes of the mesa, which she claimed the creatures used to access the surface. Around the same time that the investigators were taking Jerry Julian's statement, separate claims of a possible alien base concealed beneath the Archuleta Mesa were being directed towards the local authorities. Security staff at the Kirtland Air Force Base began to receive a string of detailed allegations from a local businessman, stating that he had documented mysterious activity both above and below the mountain chain. Paul Benowitz was already well known to the senior officers at the base, following reports he'd submitted to them of strange lights in the sky above his home in the Four Valleys district of Albuquerque. He now claimed that in addition to the lights he had filmed, he had intercepted mysterious energy emissions and radio transmissions, and that these were emanating from beneath the mesa. The businessman had also taken to conducting regular flights across the mountains in his private aircraft, photographing anything he deemed out of the ordinary. Invited onto the base to speak in person, he showed them photos of what he believed to be paths and doorways cut into the rock, miles away from any existing road or highway. He drew maps of alleged air vents and access points, and cited interviews he had conducted with the owners of mutilated cattle and locals who claimed to have been abducted in the vicinity of the mesa. But the more detail that the impassioned Benowitz chose to add to this ad hoc briefing, the less credibility he was extended by his audience. He began to panic, citing discussions with shadowy government agents, claiming that the extraterrestrials living below the mountain were one of 3 separate species to have visited Earth. But it was the assertion that a whole floor of the alleged alien base contained vats filled with human organs and body parts harvested by the alien visitors, which saw him ridiculed and finally escorted off the base. Shortly after this, as the businessman's mental health and coherence continued to deteriorate, he suffered a nervous breakdown. On the advice of doctors, his family applied to have him committed to a psychiatric facility in 1988, seemingly removing any shred of credibility his initial reports to the military may have contained. But perhaps the most amazing aspect of the stories told by Paul Benowitz is that they are by no means the only such detailed allegations of a secret base concealed beneath the town of Dulce. During the mid-1990s, a former Air Force technician by the name of Thomas Costello went public, confirming that there was indeed a hidden facility underneath the Archuleta Mesa. More incredible still was that Costello claimed that this was not an extraterrestrial base, but one constructed by the United States government, where aliens and human scientists worked together on genetic experiments. Costello related how he had been a US Air Force photographer based at Nellis in Las Vegas, but in the early 1970s had been transferred to the secret Dulce base in New Mexico. Whilst there, he was responsible for maintaining the facility's extensive surveillance network and for documenting some of the work being conducted in the laboratories. Costello even went as far as to offer photographic evidence with his testimony of what he purported to be some form of alien hybrid suspended in a vat of fluid in one of the labs. But barely had journalists time to digest his claims that the Dulce base was just one of many such facilities linked by a vast underground railroad network before he disappeared from public view altogether. However, his claims would later resurface when a further whistleblower came forward, this time from within the ranks of the Dulce Police Department itself. A former reservation police detective named Avery Tafoya, who had been researching the testimony of Jerry Julian, related how he had stumbled across the report written by federal investigators assigned to the case. To his amazement, in addition to the events described by the victim, they had included detailed drawings of a sprawling military facility, exactly where Julian claimed the hidden opening in the mountain was situated. The drawings depicted that the base had 7 different levels, including accommodation blocks, storage facilities and laboratories. It was also serviced by an underground train network similar to that alleged by Thomas Costello. Armed with this information, Tafoya stated that he had made a number of attempts to climb the mountain and see the facility for himself, only to be defeated by adverse weather conditions on each and every occasion. Not to be deterred, he had then used a thermal camera to document strange apertures and vents built into the rock of the mountain, and recorded what sounded like large machines being operated beneath the slopes. Over the years, the United States military has gone to great lengths in denying that Dulce Base exists, or that it's part of a network of hidden underground facilities. And it would seem that part of their strategy to do so has involved a concerted effort to undermine the credibility of those making the claims. The background of Thomas Costello remains shrouded in uncertainty, with attempts to locate and review his military service records seeming to suggest he never existed. Photographs associated with his testimony have proven to be forgeries, and no formal interview with him has ever been unearthed. Members of the intelligence community have also come forward and admitted to deliberately feeding false information to Paul Benowitz. It is alleged that having become uncomfortable with his obsession and surveillance of the secure Manzano weapons storage complex, the Air Force invented the fictional Dulce base in order to distract the businessman. They even claim to have placed machinery and fake air vents on the Archuleta Mesa for him to photograph, in order to convince him that a base existed there and draw him away from genuine military facilities. Gabriel Valdez himself has always refused to believe stories of a base at the Mesa, extraterrestrial or otherwise. Prior to his death in 2011, the former police officer told his son that he believed it was humans who had mutilated the cattle near the town, and not aliens. He cited secretive nuclear testing in and around New Mexico during the 1960s, claiming samples had secretly been removed from local cattle to test for radiation poisoning. There are equally detailed cases both for and against the existence of a base beneath the Archuleta Mesa, and the secretive work which is allegedly being conducted there. With so many stories, it is difficult to know which sources to trust. It is not beyond all possibility that the US government is in possession of secret underground military bases, constructed well away from prying eyes. But at the same time, some of the claims attached to them seem so outlandish that they push any notion of their existence towards ridicule. However, throughout this episode, we have deliberately avoided the most detailed and impassioned evidence for such an underground structure at Dulce. That of a man who claimed he was a former worker at the secretive site and had survived a horrifying battle unfolding between human and extraterrestrial forces during the excavation of what would become the eventual facility there. Join us next week as we examine the testimony of one Phil Schneider.